Good afternoon, friends. On behalf of Press Information Bureau, I welcome you all to this press conference on Economic Survey 2014-15, which was tabled in the Parliament today. We are privileged to have with us Dr. Arvind Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor. I extend a warm welcome to you, sir. I also welcome Dr. Ila Patnaik, Additional Economic Advisor, Dr. H.A.C. Prasad, Additional Economic Advisor, Shri Kalmakar, Senior Economic Advisor, Dr. Anandi Subramaniam, Senior Economic Advisor. Friends, first there will be opening remarks with a PowerPoint presentation by Dr. Arvind Subramanian. After that, we will take questions. I request you to kindly switch off your mobiles or keep them on silent mode. Over to Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Yeah.
First of all, let me Lights should be off, yeah? Oh, you want the lights on or off? On, okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Nornia. Thanks to all of you for coming here and taking the time and the afternoon. I'm told the Prime Minister is giving a very rousing speech, so I'm sorry to keep you away from that. I know you're all very anxious about the budget, and as you should be, and I think it's going to be, it's the kind of event of the year. But I would urge you to be patient, please. Today, we're not going to talk about the budget. We're going to talk about, the state of the economy and its many challenges. Before I begin, I have to, say with, deepest sincerity that, the economic survey is not an individual effort. It's completely a collective effort. And you should think of me just as the medium for channeling, the views, the reactions, the insights, the wisdom of literally hundreds of people in India and around the world. But especially, I want to thank my terrific colleagues of the Economic Division in the Ministry of Finance. You see 4 of them sitting here. And then I also have my colleagues sitting here. My colleagues have been named. I want to name the others: Dr. Arvind Subramanian, Dr. Rajat Sachar, Dr. K.L. Prasad, and of course, many others as well. I also want to thank very much a colleague of mine who's been amazingly supportive of this, Mr. Rajiv Meharishi, the Finance Secretary. Without his support, a lot of this would not have been possible. I also want to thank 2 friends who've had a big impact on my thinking over the years, Devesh Kapoor of the University of Pennsylvania and Josh Feldman of the International Monetary Fund. I would like to thank them as well. I want to thank also a team that's been working closely with me for the last 2.5 months, burning the midnight oil with me. I'd like to name them in Siddharth George, Sutirtha Roy, Syed Zubair, Kapil Patidar, Rohit Lamba, and Rangeet Ghosh. Thank you all for your effort. And of course, above all, I think none of this would have been possible but for the support, encouragement, and freedom given by the Honorable Finance Minister. So with that, let me begin. Let me say that I'm going to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes. And then if I start seeing drooping eyelids, falling faces, I will try and, but for the moment, I urge you, plead for your undivided attention. So let me give a kind of background to the structure of this year's economic survey. It's departed a little bit from its predecessors. There are now, in fact, 2 volumes. Volume 1, which is kind of a little bit analytical, forward-looking, and even prescriptive, but it sits very much on the shoulders and benefits from all the wisdom of Volume 2, which is, of course, a summary of the current economic situation. Just to give you a sense of, the chapters, so Volume 1 has 10 chapters, Volume 2 has, similar 10 chapters. The difference being that Volume 2 is a little bit more, recording what has happened, and Volume 1 kind of tries to look forward. So, for example, in Volume 2, you'll see the state of the economy, public finance, monetary management and intermediation, external sector, prices, industry, services, climate change, and social and other sectors as well. I need to find the cursor here, and I can't find it. Oh, here it is. Okay, and then what role does the economic survey play? I think broadly it plays 3 roles. It's actually a repository of facts and data, and in some ways Volume 2 will, I think, stand the test of time because it's a record of everything that's happened and provides valuable facts and data. It's a technical analysis, but above all, I think it's also a kind of ideas-generating document, generating ideas to inform, contemporary policy issues. I want to say a couple of things by way of prefatory remarks, and I really mean this, want to underscore this very strongly. the economic survey in some ways is written with the luxury of, not being constrained by politics. This is almost like a wish list of things that, ideally should be done. And so, anyone looking to say, oh, this was said in the survey, therefore it has implications, et cetera, I mean, I would urge you not to make any such extension or comparison. That's a very important point. The other point, I think, is that, when you write something like this, you have to try and choose. And in choosing, you make, both mistakes of exclusion and inclusion. So, and you'll find that in this survey as well. So my apologies for people who think, important policies have not been discussed, and for people who think, there's a lot in here that shouldn't have gone in here. So apologies both ways to everyone. What is the big picture today? I mean, I think the big picture is, that India finds itself in a sweet spot. And of course, there's that famous line from that famous speech, a moment that comes but rarely in history. And that moment has come because in some ways there is both a political mandate for reform and change, and there is a relatively benign external environment which really opens up the possibility for India to achieve sustainable double-digit growth. Now, I want to emphasize that the external environment being benign is true in two senses. One, of course, as a net oil importer, oil prices and commodity prices are, remarkably low, which benefits us a lot and gives us this extra room. But it's also a sense that the external environment is that, India, relative to other countries, is looking good because a number of other countries are facing challenges, in Europe, Japan, China is slowing down, and Russia, Brazil, there are also South Africa, for example. So other comparator countries are kind of facing challenges, and so India kind of stands out as a bright spot. So that's where this historic moment comes from. And so if India can attain this double-digit growth, durably, then, of course, it allows India to meet two, I think, absolutely fundamental objectives, which is what growth is all about, which is, to borrow from the Mahatma, wiping every tear from every eye, which is looking after the poor and the vulnerable. That is a fundamental objective of growth. So that's achieved with double-digit growth. And of course, the second big objective is you want to create opportunities for what has increasingly become, young, middle class, and aspirational India. So this is the kind of revolution of rising expectations that's happened over the last 10, 15 years. People want change, want opportunities, want growth, and that's what this is all about. So the question is, how can this growth be achieved? And this is what the survey tries to, kind of get into to some extent. Now, I've just listed all the policies for double-digit growth that this survey is going to cover. But as I said, there are many important ones that I may have left out. There are some ones that, maybe shouldn't belong in here. But this is just a kind of list of things that we have chosen to focus on in the context of this economic survey. So let's begin with macroeconomic stability. And of course, the big news here is that there have been dramatic improvements in the state of India's macroeconomic situation. We know that as recently as July, August of 2013, India was on the brink of a crisis. Inflation at its recent peak was about 11.2%. Now it's down to 5%, 5.1%. Wholesale price inflation is in fact in deflation territory. So that's a remarkable change. The current account deficit has come down remarkably from a peak of about 4.6. I mean, next quarter or 1 or 2 quarters ahead, people are even predicting a surplus. Stock prices have gone up because of foreign inflows which have poured in, about 55 billion this year at the latest reckoning. Interest rates are coming down. And of course, last but not least, the growth deceleration that we saw for about 12 quarters there, which you see in the lower right-hand corner, that deceleration seems to have bottomed out, and India, the recovery seems to be set in motion. I'll speak a little bit about those numbers in a second, but this is actually a really remarkable turnaround, which sets the conditions for durable, sustainable growth. Now, the Bible says, man does not live by bread alone, And investors don't live by macroeconomic stability or just the fiscal deficit alone. And when investors view countries in relative terms as investment prospects, they look both at macro stability and at growth. So we've computed a very kind of simplistic, crude, what we call the Rational Investment Rating Index, RIRI, which combines macroeconomic stability with growth. It's a simple index, and we call it rational because there are less rational ways of doing this, and some seem to be doing that, which is to focus just on macro stability or the deficit. So this is a more rational index, and what this shows is that the dark red line is India, from being below its competitor countries, it's now racing ahead. And if you look at the chart, the dark red line is actually based on the new growth rates, and I don't want to cheat here, so I've also shown the dotted line based on old growth rates. But what you do find is that on this index, there is a turnaround, and India does better than its BBB investment grade peers, and on some counts, also better than peers in the investment grade category above India. And of course, only China does better, and compared to all the BRIC countries. So in a sense, the promise of India is really a modicum of macro stability being the basis for long-run sustainable growth. And this is something that, I think is also quite remarkable about India. So it's an attractive investment destination, especially relative to its counterparts in the period ahead. What's happening on reforms? I don't want to go through all the risks of reforms. I think the way I would characterize them is that there have been several reforms which are accumulating into potentially something important. But there are also some game-changing reforms, in process, on the anvil, already being done. And I will highlight two of them, not because I think there aren't others, but these I think really are very important. The goods and services tax, if it comes in, it's going to be a real game changer in many senses. Getting India as a common market, making the tax base more buoyant, improving compliance and reducing corruption. And then also, I think the whole direct benefit transfers, being able to do that effectively, I think, again, is a potential game changer for a number of reasons I will explain later on. We call this, and I'm told we are calling this the jam number trinity solution to a lot of India's ailments. Jam number being, the Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and mobile. If you combine these three numbers, a lot can happen. Moving on to inflation, I think the big story here is that there is a structural shift in the inflationary process in a good direction. I think the economy is going to outperform the RBI's forecast going forward. The forecast is about 5 to 5.5%, and I think which opens up the space for easier monetary conditions. And this structural shift is based on three factors. One is the international. On the left-hand side, you see the price of oil going forward in the next year is forecast to be about 29% less than this year. Of course, things can turn around very quickly in this business, but of careful analysis of supply, demand, and geopolitical conditions suggests that even if prices increase, they won't increase by too much. So that's going to be favorable for inflation going forward. The second domestic reason, I think, is that agriculture has been a big source of inflation in India, but rural wage growth has been decelerating remarkably, and I think that's a key element in the structural inflationary process in India. And third, I would highlight something that's happened very recently, but very dramatically. This is a survey of the bottom chart of household inflation expectations done by the RBI. For a long time, it was a bit of a mystery. It was very persistent, even though inflation was coming down. But bang, in the last survey, there's been absolutely like a stone. Inflationary expectations have dropped by about 7-8 percentage points. And this is important not just as a signal of what people expect, but also has the potential to moderate wage pressures because wages often are set on the basis of inflation expectations. So I think these three factors, one domestic and one international and two domestic factors, are what are going to keep inflation relatively muted in the months ahead. On growth, our forecast is for something between 8 and 8.5% for 2015-16. And the reason we say that is we say that for 4 reasons. One, there's going to be the cumulative effect of reforms that should provide a boost to growth. Remember, this 8 to 8.5 is something like 0.6 to 1.1% more than what the CSO said for last year, which was 7.4 GDP at market prices growth. So we think it's going to accelerate, as I said, because of 4 reasons. 1, reforms. 2, oil price declines are going to act like a tax cut, both for consumers and firms, so they're going to be spending more. Third, as I said, monetary policy conditions should ease on the back of lower inflation. And finally, if the weather gods or the weather forecasters are to be trusted, I think the monsoon is predicted to be better this year despite the El Nino and so on. So if all that happens, I think the acceleration of what we're saying could happen. But here's a caveat that I want to place here. When anyone sees numbers like 8 to 8.5, this is roaring, East Asian style, Chinese style, roaring dynamism and growth. But I would be careful about interpreting it that way, because as we know, the new GDP growth series have come out. They say there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, but in this case, I would say, there are uncertainties, puzzles, and statistics, and this one is very much in the nature of an uncertainty and a puzzle, because the level of the number, especially the 6.4 number that came out for 13-14 is still something that we're trying to understand here. And I think, so unless we're really sure that the value of that number is borne out by longer data, I would tend to treat that cautiously. And just to see what is going on, what we did was we decomposed the growth by sector. So on the first 2 panels, you have growth new series minus old series, and there the difference in the deflators between the 2 series. So it seems like something is going on in measuring manufacturing, which is still a bit of a mystery, and we need to get to the bottom of that. So my conclusion here is to say that the balance of evidence shows that India is still a recovering economy, not a surging economy that can be thought of as a tiger as yet. What are the risks to this scenario? I think the external sector, people have spoken about the Fed tightening interest rates, turmoil in Greece, oil prices going up. I think all of these exist. We should be careful, not complacent. We should be watchful. But I think for the moment, I think that the external sector outlook looks quite good. As I said, the current account deficit next year is going to come in below 1%. That's the forecast. And in some ways, I think one important point to realize is that as the current account improves, the problem for India might be more too much rather than too little capital, because for a given level of the current account, the inflows coming in put a lot of pressures on the exchange rate. So it creates the dilemma of, how do you manage, how do you maintain stability? How do you maintain the competitiveness of the Indian economy? I think that's going to be a challenge. And as a kind of personal aside, I want to say that in India, when we think about the external sector, I think one thing we perhaps don't focus enough on, which is, we don't think about the external sector enough in geopolitical and geostrategic terms. I think part of it is because we've not, been a kind of big power. But I think as India becomes a rising power, there are useful lessons to be drawn from the Chinese experience, which I've kind of studied a little bit. And the question is that, if you think that China has a lot of power because, of course, because of its dynamism, but also because of its reserves, which are now $4 trillion. So the question is, if India wants to be a geoeconomic, geopolitical power, should it also strive for, a high level of reserves, thrown out a number, $750 billion, $1 trillion over the long run, to kind of back up its aspirations to be a rising power. That's just the thought I'd leave you with. And it's something that I think we need to think more carefully about. So the first big kind of issue that we tackle in detail in volume 1 of the survey is the 14th Finance Commission. And I want to make 4 points on this, which are actually somewhat, I think, underappreciated, especially in the light of comments made in the last few days. First, I mean, I want to insist that this is absolutely revolutionary and a watershed in the history of Indian federalism. And remember, the background to this, when you think about the 14th Finance Commission recommendations, the background to this is that over the last 40, 50 years, India has been progressively decentralizing. De jure, political power has moved to the states. De facto, economic and political power have moved to the states. But there was one big aberration to this process, which was the centrally sponsored schemes run by the previous regime, in which a lot more the center arrogated to itself more power, fiscal power or fiscal authority. What this Finance Commission is doing, therefore, is actually, in a sense, rectifying that aberration to some extent. So the first point I want to make is that if you look at the numbers in terms of the devolution of power, on the revenue side, much more revenues are going to go to the states. You know, you've seen the number for the tax devolution from 32 to 42%. But even if you add the non-planned transfers by the 14th Finance Commission and do the arithmetic, the combined share going out is something like from 38 to 49%. It's huge, unprecedented. The last two finance commissions, gave an increase of about 1 and 1.5 percentage points. So this is just huge. But then people come back and say that, you've got to look at it from not just in terms of the plan, the tax and the non-planned grants, but also the planned transfers. If you then add all three up, you do find that the increase goes from about 62 to 65, which is less than, the headline number that you've seen on the tax devolution. But I would insist that actually the lower that number is, the combined, actually is a measure of increased fiscal autonomy for the states, because what it's saying is that now the states get to spend more of their own money and the center gets to spend less of the money. So on the tax side, huge increase. On the expenditure side, much more is going to be done by the states. So combined, fiscal autonomy, fiscal freedom for the states is going to increase dramatically. That's point number one. Point number two is that one of the unnoticed things about these transfers compared to the central systems is that if you look at the graph on below, it turns out that these fiscal commission transfers, finance commission transfers, are very progressive in the sense that on average, more transfers per capita go to the states that are poorer on average in terms of NSDP. This, by the way, was much less true of the central plan transfers. Because they were discretionary and determined by the center, because they had moved away from formula-based mechanisms, they had actually become less and less progressive over time. So when you switch more fiscal finance commission transfers, less central plan transfers, the progressivity of the system actually goes up enormously. So that's one key implication of the finance commission transfers that I think should be noted. The third thing that should be noted is that the concern that this will be a bonanza for the states and will be badly spent and therefore will undermine overall fiscal discipline should also be treated with caution, because on average, in the last few years, the states have been much more fiscally prudent than even the center. The average deficit of the states combined has been something like 2.7%, compared with the center of about 4.1% recently. So that concern, I think, should be also viewed with caution. The fourth point I want to make, which is, I think, really, really important, is shown by the chart on the bottom right-hand corner, which is that if you now look at how much of overall government revenue, overall government tax revenue, central government and state governments, how much of that now is going to the states to be spent? That's increasing from 55% to about 62%. So in some ways now, the states get almost, well, not almost, about almost two-thirds of total tax revenues collected by India as a whole. So the implication is that when you're assessing India's public finances, it is more and more important to look at it at the consolidated level and not just at the level of the central government. I think it's really important. This is an important fact, and this is something that you should all bear in mind going forward, thinking about, what is India's fiscal roadmap, what is India's fiscal strategy. It has to be seen more and more at that level because, the states now are collecting much more in taxes and much more than the center and spending more of it than the center. Now, with that by way of background, I want to talk a little bit about the fiscal situation, fiscal policy, and so on. How bored are you? Are you still bored, or are you awake? Carry on. Tell me where. So, wave your hand when you say it's getting too much. Huh? The philosopher Santayana said that, those who don't read history are condemned to repeat the mistakes of history. And I think it's really a valuable exercise, at least for all of us, to look at recent fiscal history, because in some ways, India is today very close to where it was in the early 2000s. The deficit was very similar, inflation was very similar, and today, like then, India was poised for rapid growth. Now, what are the lessons from those 10 years of fiscal history? I think basically what the lessons are, there were 3 periods in that history. In the first phase, rapid growth improved all the fiscal indicators. In the second phase, after 2007, when the Lehman crisis hit, India lost fiscal control, both because of following counter-cyclical tax policy, but also because the level of expenditures had been ratcheted up very high just before that via all the centrally sponsored schemes and so on. And that's what I think created the conditions partly for the crisis in 2013. And then in the last 3 years, we've seen a gradual stabilization. The red bar is the debt coming down. India's debt situation has been improving quite dramatically. The blue line is the fiscal, the black line is the fiscal deficit. You see that going up and now stabilizing. And the blue line is, in fact, revenue expenditure. What you find is that India lost control a little bit of expenditures, especially revenue expenditure, and that led to some troubles. And of course, the last point, you see that dotted line at the bottom, capital expenditure has been stuck and stagnant. And so revenue expenditures went up, capital expenditures suffered, and so the quality of expenditures in India suffered in the last 10 years. So how do we take this going forward? I think we have to situate this now, even decisions, near-term decisions, have to be situated in a medium-term context. And clearly, for our medium-term objective of 3% needs to be met. I think India needs to move towards the golden rule, where borrowing is for capital formation on average over the cycle. And as I said, the lessons from history is that expenditure control and the switching from revenue expenditure to capital expenditure are going to be important. The reason we're emphasizing the expenditure side, it's not because India's tax to GDP ratio should not go up, but the lesson of the last 10 years was that if you get growth and if we are going to implement the GST, there will be a natural buoyancy to the tax to GDP ratio, which history suggests should be at least 2 to 2.5%, so that if you can get expenditures under control, the natural buoyancy in revenues will actually allow India to comfortably meet the medium-term fiscal targets. That being said, what should we do in the short term? The short term, I would argue that the pressure for accelerated fiscal consolidation has lessened somewhat because India no longer is in a macroeconomically vulnerable situation, not as much as it used to be. So I think that needs to condition what we do in the short run, and also new pressures for ramping up public investment, which I'll talk about. That will also go into short-term decisions. And also, importantly, in the short run, these decisions will have to be conditioned by the Finance Commission recommendations, as I said, because a lot more of the money now is going to the states. Nevertheless, I would say that the lessons of expenditure control and switching towards investment are going to remain valid. And the last point, of course, which I've stressed, but I want to stress again, that with the Finance Commission, we need to look at now India's balance sheet and public finances at a consolidated level. So next we come to what we call the wiping every tear from every eye objective of the government. And here the Prime Minister has emphasized that we should absolutely support the poor, which is absolutely true. but we should try our best to make sure that these subsidies are effective, well-targeted, etc. So one of the amazing things for us was, just listing all the subsidies that India is providing was a kind of an eye-opener. Railways, LPG, kerosene, fertilizer, rice, wheat, electricity, water, sugar, they're all kind of subsidized, right? But, people need the support. So the question is, how effective are these subsidies at reaching the intended beneficiaries, namely the poor? And some work that we've done in the context of the last 1 month produces some really surprising results. The sector we've studied most carefully is kerosene. And here the numbers are actually quite striking. So if you take kerosene, there are actually 3 sources of ineffective targeting. And for me, certainly going through the taxonomy helped. One, there's a lot of PDS kerosene that just disappears. I call this phantom kerosene, in the sense that it is not accounted for by all the recorded consumption of kerosene. So this is just phantom kerosene which disappears. The second set of leakage occurs because this PDS kerosene actually does not reach PDS consumers. That's a second source of leakage. And the third, of course, is that how much of the PDS allocation actually does go to the poor amongst the PDS consumers. So there are 3 sources of ineffective targeting. And what we find is that phantom kerosene is something like 25%. The amount of PDS that doesn't reach the PDS is about 41%. And of the remaining 49%, 46% reaches the bottom 3 deciles, which are the poor, roughly speaking. Actually, 22.5% is the Tendulkar poverty line. So even if you take 3 deciles, it's generous. So on average, about only 25% of PDS allocations, or something roughly, actually reaches the poor. So in a sense, this is India's challenge. How do you make this more effective? I think the LPG subsidy is an amazing experiment, which I think paves the way. And the way forward has to be technology, and this is where we're talking about the JAM number trinity solution. You combine the Jan Dhan financial account with the Aadhaar number and the mobile, and over time, if you can get to seamless cashless transfers, then there is the prospect of reaching what I call the 2 nirvanas. The 2 nirvanas are the following: that one, you can actually support the poor in the best possible manner, which has to be an overriding objective. But there's a second nirvana coming from here, which is that it then liberates prices to perform their rightful role of allocating resources and promoting efficiency. Remember that we talk a lot in India about 2nd and 3rd and 4th generation reform. I would say that there's a 0th generation of reform, which is the basic thing that agents, consumers, and producers should face market prices. And if we continue having subsidies, the talk of 2nd and 3rd generation is a little bit undermined by the fact that we haven't even done the 1st or the 0th generation of reform. So I think in some ways the grand bargain of Indian political economy is that you meet equity objectives better through direct income support, and then you can also attain all your efficiency objectives. So this JAM number trinity solution, I think, is one of the real potential game changers going forward. Now, next we talk about the private investment challenge. We call this the balance sheet syndrome with Indian characteristics, which is holding back private investment. So what we've done is we've looked at stalled projects as a window into private investment to get a sense of, how is private investment doing and will it revive going forward? And what we find is quite interesting, that the total stock of stalled projects, according to the data that we have, is about 8.8 lakh crores now, and 80 to 85% is accounted for by the private sector. So the private sector accounts for most of the stalled projects. That's point number 1. Point number 2, which is very surprising, is that actually we think all the stalled projects, or a majority of them, are in infrastructure. It turns out that in the recent past, manufacturing is as much, if not greater, in terms of stalled projects than infrastructure. Point number 3, very interesting, is when project managers are asked or coded, why have projects stalled? The reasons given for the private sector and the public sector are quite different. The private sector projects seem to be stalled because of changed market conditions, whereas public sector projects seem to be stalled because of inability to obtain regulatory clearances. Now, because the private sector is implicated in this, what has happened, of course, is that the profitability of the private sector is quite weak. For example, we have a chart here, right-hand side corner, which is the interest coverage ratio. How many firms can generate enough cash to pay their interest? And it turns out that about 1/3 or 35% don't generate even enough cash to pay their interest, so the interest coverage ratio is less than 1. So that's the profitability side. And then on the debt side, debt equity has been rising in India and in fact is amongst the highest in the emerging market world. So in fact, therefore, the private sector balance sheets are very weak. That's part of this holding back investment. And the analog, of course, of that is that the banking sector is actually also stressed because it's carrying now a lot of stressed assets in the system. So if you put together the weakness in the private sector and the weakness in the banking sector, what you find is that, and a number of other related problems of how you can do this going forward, you find that private investment is relatively weak, and that's the case for public investment that we make in the economic survey. Turning to banking, I think one of the things certainly for me, it's a bit of a surprise that all the discussion about banking, if you think about it in India over the last 6 months, has been the Nayak Committee report on governance reforms, how much to recapitalize, what's going to happen when Basel III requirements hit the banks, will they have enough cash to lend support to the economy? But we wanted to step back and say, let's look at the banks in terms of 4 parameters: policy, size, competition, and ownership. And what do we find on that? And let me quickly run through this. What we find on the policy side, which is the left-hand side, is something that we call double financial repression. On the liability side, banks have had, depositors have got very low real rate of return because of high inflation. So the real return to depositors has been low. That's one side of what we call financial repression. And on the other side, you have requirements on banks to hold government paper or to lend to certain sectors, the statutory liquidity requirement ratio and the priority sector lending requirement, which depress the return on assets. So, on both sides of the balance sheet, therefore, you have financial repression. So that's something that we need to think about more carefully. The second, what we find is that in terms of size, do we think the Indian banking sector is big or small? Broadly, what we find is that if you control for the level of development of the economy, actually the Indian banking system doesn't seem too big nor too small. And even in the period when, a lot of lending went on in the last, in the period of the boom between 2002 and 2012, it turns out that Indian banks were imprudent, but no more or no less imprudent than countries at comparable takeoff cycles. When countries grew as fast in history, they too expanded credit very rapidly. So in that sense, I think the Indian system, while, there are concerns, that's not the important problem. So policy, size, competition. It's one of the real puzzles of Indian banking. If you see this chart, we put that circle, that in the period when the economy experienced the most rapid private sector-led growth ever in Indian history, the share of private banking remained constant in loans and deposits. Now, of course, part of it was because the public sector banks were enthusiastic, or maybe over-enthusiastic, but even allowing for that, why the private sector did not expand its activity in terms of advances is a bit of a mystery, and that I think needs much more examination. So I think, so is there something about the competitive structure that prevents private sector banks from becoming bigger and becoming more active is a question that needs more thought. And the last question is about ownership. I think we talk about public sector banks as if they're a monolith in India. I think India has public sector banks and public sector banks and public sector banks. So the chart on the right-hand side, it takes one measure, how many stressed assets there are in the system, and what it does is it plots that indicator For both the public sector banks and the private sector banks, the black line is the average public sector banks. The dotted lines represent the second worst and the second best public sector bank. And what it tells you is that there's a lot of heterogeneity amongst public sector banks. There are some good, well-performing banks and some bad-performing banks, but it does turn out to be the case that even the best public sector bank does worse than, on average, than the private sector bank. So I think we have to think about public sector banks much more, in a granular fashion rather than treating them. So we combine all this and come up with what we call the policy options, the 4Ds. We need to think about deregulation, about financial repression, because remember, now as inflation comes down, real returns for depositors is starting to go up. So on the liability side, we're addressing financial repression, but on the asset side, it's still financially repressed. So I think we need to think about what we need to do on the asset side. Second, differentiate within the public sector banks. 3, diversify both within and outside banking, much more role for developing corporate capital markets and corporate bond markets. And of course, the last T is disinter, which is basically saying we need better bankruptcy procedures to bring some, to rescue some and maybe allow some to go. So that's on the banking side. Yesterday was the rail budget. I think one of the strong messages we had in the mid-year economic analysis is that the country needs much more public investment in the short run. Private investment has to be the engine of growth in the long run, but because of the problems in the private sector, we need to think about public investment playing a catalytic role. And a case can be made that, the railways could be for this government what roads were for the first NDA government. And we've done some work on the railway sector, which really is quite striking. What we find is, underinvestment, congestion, weak service, et cetera, et cetera. And look at some of the indicators. For example, underinvestment, look at the capacity addition. In 1990, we were ahead of China, and now China is way ahead. So, for example, China has spent on average 11 times more per capita in investment in the railways than we have, and about 3 to 4 percentage points of GDP more, much more capacity. That is a really disturbing chart, that how much of the traffic on average has gone to freight relative to railways. And you see that India is a lagging performer. And in India, it used to be in the mid-60s, in the 1970s. 60 to 65% of all freight traffic was with the railways. And by 2020, it would come down to 20%. Now, this is a really disturbing development because road freight is less competitive, leads to more congestion, more pollution, and generally is much more inferior for freight carrying than the railways are. And so I think there is a good case to be made for ramping up investment in railways, which, of course, the railway minister yesterday prefigured with his budget. And we also find that the multipliers from investment in the railways are quite high, something like 5. So, provided we can get the reforms going in the railways as well, a combination of reforms and investment can really make this a dynamic sector going forward. What is the attention level like? Fading, huh? Okay. So I think I'm going to skip. You may want to read about Skill India. Let me go very quickly. I think there's a very nice chapter on how to make agriculture not 1, not 29, but in India we have the surprise for me. Not 1, not 29, but thousands of markets, agricultural markets. And there's a very nice chapter here in terms of how reforms can be undertaken. The flip side of the Make in India challenge is actually the trade challenge. Really quite unnerving is the fact that our exports have stagnated as a share of GDP. The external environment is getting much more adverse, and all these trade agreements are being negotiated, which is excluding India. So the prospect for exports is looking less benign than it used to about 5-6 years ago, and that's something we need to worry about quite a lot. There's a section on climate change, because I think the one important point to make is that we in India, as a result of the diesel excises that we've implemented, which no doubt we implemented for fiscal reasons and so on, I think have had tremendous benefits in terms of climate change. We now have a carbon tax regime in place, which is better for petroleum, which is higher, much higher than what is internationally recognized as a reasonable norm for taxation of carbon. Similarly, I think we're making progress on the coal cess. I think with all these things, we can go to Paris for the Paris negotiations with a lot to contribute. This is way beyond my pay grade. It's outside the realms of my expertise. But it did strike me that, India, as I said, India is young, middle class, and aspirational, but it's still stubbornly male. And I think this is something that we need to address carefully. I was struck by what's happening on the family planning side, which is, incentives, misaligned incentives leading to, reduction in reproductive choice and autonomy. We just signaled that, I think, as an important issue because the Prime Minister has made, Nari Shakti an important, so I think we need to think more about that. So you could read that also in the survey. I think, especially in volume 2, there's a very nice and extensive discussion of the state of education based on the Asar report produced by Pratham. Learning outcomes have basically stagnated, both reading and arithmetic. It's a cause for worry. We need to spend more time on that. And then I want to end with this last slide. So this is a question that, you saw the cover of The Economist, Will the Elephant Fly? And in the last 3 months, you must be sick with references to, the expectations and, big bang reforms in India. That's what India needs to do. I think we just need to step back, and this is the last slide, so please pay attention. I think it's an important point because, what is big bang reforms? In part of my research, I've studied, growth across the world. What the post-war evidence suggests that, basically big bang reforms occur during or in the immediate aftermath of reforms. President Obama's advisor famously said, never waste a crisis. I think what he meant was, of course, that, if you miss this opportunity, it's going to be very difficult. And that's the sense in which, and that's kind of the post-war evidence as well. The second thing about big bang reforms is that, in robust democracies with multiple actors and institutions which have, the power to do, undo, veto, block, big bang reforms are absolutely the exception rather than the rule. So if you think about India today, it's neither in crisis and it's a kind of vibrant, frustratingly vibrant democracy with all these multiple checks and balances. So I think the standard, that big bang reform standard is, I think, an unreasonable standard to hold. And remember, there are lots of things in democracies which take a lot of time to do. If you think about reforming institutions, the phrase that captures that is Max Weber's phrase. That's like the slow boring of hard boards. So I think the standard of big bang reforms that especially international investors have about India is a completely unreasonable standard. That's point number one. But Max Weber's wisdom should not be treated as a license for inaction or procrastination, because the fact is that this is a window of opportunity where there's a political mandate for change, and I think this opportunity should be seized in India. And it's not an opportunity that is an opportunity for the moment or for months. It's an opportunity for a regime that's in power with the mandate for change. So one way of thinking about what are impressive reforms would be to say that, in areas of policy that the central government controls, the levers that it can pull, there should be a decisive shift in policy. But in other areas where it doesn't control, or where Max Weber's insight holds, I think there you just have to plug away. What we call a persistent, encompassing, and creative incrementalism. So if you combine, decisive policy shifts in areas that the government controls and kind of a creative incrementalism in other areas, then I think all this can add together to constitute something that's, I think, very important, very meaningful. Whether you want to call it a bang or a whimper, it's up to you, but I think it could accumulate into something very important. So thank you for your patience and your attention. I know that in a world full of information, as Herbert Simon said, the greatest scarcity is the scarcity of attention. So I think I've only aggravated the problem this afternoon, but I seek your indulgence. Please read the economic survey. More chapters will become available, and feel free to criticize, get back, respond, and of course, if you feel like praising it, that's most welcome too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. After this comprehensive presentation, I think there'll be very few questions, I hope. Yeah? Yeah, let's start with this gentleman, please.
Hi, sir. I'm Shubham Batra from Cogensis Newswire. So while you said that the medium-term fiscal deficit target of 3% needs to be met, you've also said in the survey somewhere that the progress towards achieving that target is limited. Could you elaborate on that? And what's your outlook on interest rates in FY16?
I don't think we say at all that the progress towards that is limited at all. We don't say that. In fact, what we say is that, and we said this in the mid-year as well, that this year the 4.1 was a challenging target, and growth was lower than forecast. Buoyancy had been overestimated, and despite that, the government is going to meet the 4.1. I think what we said is that progress to the medium-term target should be conditioned by a lot of other factors, temporary factors as well. So I don't think we said that at all. And on the interest rate, remember, 2 points. One, these are decisions made by the Reserve Bank of India, so I cannot give you a thing. But I think our analysis suggests that, and this is not something that, even the RBI, when it issued its last policy statement, it was clear that that was not just a one-off, but they themselves, presented it as a kind of regime shift. And the data seem to bear that out. I think we're going to have a moderated inflation going forward. I think we're going to probably overshoot the RBI's forecast. So I think the space does open up for an easing of monetary conditions.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Please, just the 1 minute.
Yes, sir.
1 minute,
Please.
1 minute, Badri. I'll come back to you.
Sir, Shweta Rajpal Kohli from NDTV. So it's important that you've mentioned that you yourself are puzzled by the new GDP figures, but your own growth forecast of 8.1 to 8.5% is based on the new GDP figures. You're saying that the new numbers are suggesting that India is not a tiger yet, it's not a surging economy, still a recovering economy. So if we are giving that impression with those numbers, politically, of course, people are taking credit, saying India has become the fastest growing major economy. Don't you think then there's a case to revisit the formula or not accept it?
See, remember that going forward, we only have one number. We don't have the old series. So we don't have a choice
But you
on that.
yourself are not convinced as the chief economic advisor.
No, I think what needs to happen is that, all of us need to reflect on these numbers. I think the CSO will also, once they produce a longer series, we can understand them better. And all of us are going to be reflecting on these numbers and understanding, why they are what they are. But in the meanwhile, I think we have to use them, and that's what we have to use. And that's what we've done in the... I'm puzzled, as I said,
Yeah, Badri. Yeah.
Sir, 2 questions.
Sorry, and remember that the puzzle is because of the fact that, some of the numbers and some of the other evidence, are in tension, let's say, especially what happened in 13-14. That number in particular is puzzling because that was a kind of a bad year, and yet growth accelerated. So that's the puzzle. I want to insist that, if you look at just what has been done by way of improvements in data and methodology, the CSO has done an outstanding job.
Sir, two questions. One is here. Earlier this year when we met, in one of the occasions you were pushing for economic expansionism, huge public investment, and a lot of money to be pump priming and all that. Now you talk about fiscal consolidation, prudence, 3% deficit. Do you think you have change of heart after sitting in the North Block for 1 month? That is one question, sir.
It's a good question, yeah.
The one question. Second is, you're talking about certain areas where you wanted a cumulative reform, where you will find big bang and all that. Where is the big bang you're looking at?
So the second one is easy to answer, right? The second one is you have to wait. Yeah. So the first one is it's very easy for me to reconcile the two, because what I think we're saying in the economic survey is that it is possible to combine the need for extra investment with the need to maintain fiscal discipline. They're not inconsistent, because remember that in India, when you think about public investment, the ability to spend effectively and well is not unlimited. So the amount that we should spend gradually over time is possible within the envelope provided by the need to maintain fiscal discipline.
Yeah,
So yesterday S&P came out with its projections and it pegged the economic growth at 7.9%, which is lower than your lower band. So what is the rationale for your optimism, greater optimism, and is there any method by which you can give us the number on GDP at factor cost on the older base so that we can compare?
Yeah, going forward, I cannot give you the GDP at factor cost on the old base. So that's why I was at pains to say that the 8 to 8.5% should be seen as how much improvement relative to last year. If last year is 7.9%, how much extra are we going to get? And is that extra justified by the underlying developments? And the case we're making is that, if last year it grew at 7.9%, then going forward, we're going to have 29% lower oil prices, right? And remember, lower oil prices means consumers have more money to spend, firms make more profits. Going forward, because oil prices and thanks to government actions, inflation has come down, monetary policy can be easier. So that's another reason, I think. Third, reforms are being slowly implemented, and we'll see the cumulative effect of that also has to add up, and agriculture should be better. So there is I think a reasonable case for saying that next year should be better than this year, 7.9. Of course, by how much we'll see, but whether one should view that absolute number 8.5 as something that is kind of sacrosanct in terms of what it connotes about the underlying thing, that's an open question.
Yeah, please.
Sir, this
I
is
will come back to you. Please hold on. Yeah.
this is Akhilesh Suman from Rajya Sabha Television. So after the economic survey was laid down in the parliament today, I was in the parliament and some of the opposition leaders were telling that you have changed the base year to 2011-12, and you yourself told us now that the economic indicators are at the level of 2000, almost the same situation is persisting. So what is the rationale behind changing the whole base year? Because they are telling that it is to fudge the data and manipulate the data and projection.
Yeah, you see, firstly, remember all those changes and everything were done by the CSO. And remember, the CSO also, there is the national, exactly, which oversees that. So I think the integrity of that process cannot be, impugned or maligned at all. I think it's one of those institutions that functions purely on technical basis. So the whole revision of the methodology has been purely technical in order to conform to international standards. The System of National Accounts 2007 international standards, and what they have done. So the rebasing is entirely for technical reasons. In the process also, they've had available to them a much bigger database, both in terms of firms and manufacturing, but also in terms of tax and revenue data. So it's really an effort to bring much more information, much better methodology, and updated data to producing this. So I think that's a completely, very well done process with a lot of integrity.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. This is Surbhi from the Indian Express. Sir, in the chapter on public finances, etc., so you've spoken about the medium and short-term fiscal policy, and sir, but on issues such as additional revenue mobilization, the survey seems to be very optimistic on GST. Is the government not going to look at other sources maybe in the long term?
I think for that you should wait for tomorrow, yeah?
Yeah. Please, Sapna.
Sir, Sapna from CNBC TV 18. On the growth numbers, it may be possible that, I'm not talking about the budget per se, but it may be possible that the estimates that will come out tomorrow in terms of, the growth numbers will be quite different from the projection of today that you have put out in the economic survey, 8.1 to 8.4. It will be actually on the lower side. So, some of your thoughts on that front. And second, sir, also you've spoken about 3% as the midterm FRBM target to be met in the fiscal deficit. There's no mention, there's no look forward for the next financial year. So next financial year also, are we expected to be on course, especially looking at the fact that oil prices are down, but now you have the Foreign Finance Commission formula and other, public investments, stuff like that. We need to push that. Just your thoughts.
I'm indiscreet, but you cannot get me into that indiscretion on the second question. That's a question that tomorrow you'll see the answer to. I just cannot answer that question. On the first one, if these numbers going to be changed? I have no idea how the numbers are going to be changed. We're going to see them when they come. But I think we would still say that whatever the number that comes in, what we project for next year will be kind of relative to that. And maybe we may need to, see how that happens. But let's wait and see.
Yeah, how do you link the behavior of the stock market with the economic fundamentals? Because the stock market, the way it is going, it seems to be is totally different than what you have projected. How do you link these two actually?
So we haven't projected anything for the stock market. So I think
the way the stock market is going. It is totally different than the fundamentals that you have projected. So does it really concern the economists that this is not the right thing, that what is happening, or maybe this is the right way that's...
any of my colleagues want to answer that? Yeah. No, the stock market has remember the stock market is very forward-looking, right? They expect, they think, I didn't say the stock market is puzzling. I see. I should go back and read. I don't remember that, but I think I think the GDP growth was puzzling. I don't think we are that puzzled by puzzled by a few things, but not by everything that's going on in the Indian economy.
Take it. Okay, please. Yeah.
So this is Deepshika from Economic Times. So on page 20 in the survey, you were saying the need for accelerated fiscal consolidation has lessened. So while you're making a case for fiscal consolidation going forward, are you hinting at relaxation in the targets or change in milestones? What exactly are you sort of hinting at?
You will not get an answer on that. You know that. I admire your persistence. But I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Yeah, please.
Hello.
Yeah.
So just wanted to know the real reason for change in format of economic survey, 2 volumes. I mean, thought that went into it basically.
I think there is no very good answer to that. I guess that we all have our quirks and idiosyncrasies, right? I mean, individuals have our quirks and idiosyncrasies, and I think, again, looking at, I've worked in some international institutions and, seen these kinds of things being done around the world. I think what the model that seems a very nice model is, you have something that looks back and something that looks forward, and something that's more descriptive and something that's more analytical and prescriptive. So I think together, they make for a very nice a whole rounded picture of the economy, which is what I think motivated partly the structure.
Yeah, that gentleman there,
So,
yes.
you mentioned that 8.8 lakh crores worth of investments is stuck in stalled projects. So, given that there is political stability at the center now, what can the government do? What will you suggest to the Finance Minister to get these projects going? Any thoughts on that?
I think that is actually a very, very good question and a very difficult question, I would say. Because I think, again, my colleagues should add to whatever I have to say. You see, just think of it this way. One way of thinking about this is the following. That in more, advanced countries like, say the US or England or France, essentially you have very good procedures for bankruptcy and exit, right? So what happens is that, investors make decisions, they go bad, And then you need a process for, two things. You need a process for sharing whatever pain has happened from that bad investment. That pain has to be shared between, the promoter, the creditor who's lent to him, the taxpayer, and the consumer. So basically, there are four broad agents who have to share that pain. And in advanced countries, you have legal processes for doing that. In India, I think we're still developing these institutions. The legal processes are slower, more difficult, lots more problems. So I think, we need to find a way where, we need to change both the legal institutions to do that, but maybe we also need some extra-legal, quasi-legal, quasi-political processes in the short run to get ourselves out of that. But, it's easier said than done. I think that's really but certainly reform of bankruptcy and our procedures has to be on the table as well. But you have...
So I can just add to that it's not necessary that all those stalled projects have to get back on track as that project itself. Because when we ask people why why the projects are stalled, many times it's because of a change in market conditions. Remember, some of those investments were planned when the economy was booming, when the world economy was booming, and today many of them are not so profitable. So it goes back to, can we break them up? Can we now sell them off? And, can we find a solution to get out of something that is perhaps no longer worth doing?
Yeah, please.
Sir, Manoj Kumar from Reuters News Agency. First, wanted to congratulate you and your team for a very comprehensive report on the state of economy. I am very curious to know about your views, if you could elaborate. So you have favored increase in public investment while favoring this medium-term fiscal deficit target of 3% at a time when the revenue growth is not picking up and the corporate results are not showing much growth. So if you could elaborate, so where is the scope for increase in the revenue, whether through increase in tax rates or through more and more privatization? Thank you.
I mean, remember that there's a short-term and a medium-term perspective that in the short term, I think we have done remarkably well in taking advantage of lower oil prices in imposing these diesel excises. So I think these diesel excises, if they stay where they are, oil prices, could fetch, quite a large sum of money. And so just on that count alone, I think next year you will see possibly the tax to revenue, gross tax revenue to GDP ratio will be higher next year if these diesel things continue. So in the short run, that's what's going to do this. In the medium term, I think as growth picks up, see, this is, someone asked this question before, how can you be so confident? If you analyze the period between 2002 to about 2011-12, the tax to GDP ratio went up by about 2.5 percentage points, 2 to 2.5, obviously because growth accelerated a lot. But there was some, but not dramatic tax reforms or tax increases. There were some increases in the service tax, both in expanding the base and in increasing the rate. If you think of the GST is going to be, provided of course it's properly done, is going to be a much more radical in terms of expanding the tax base. So if you get the growth going and this expansion of the base via the GST, then I think you can be confident also that in the medium term, the tax to GDP goes up. I mean, of course, I think the other challenge for India, I think, is that once we have this GST, which is we can have a modern indirect tax system, I think that needs to be matched going forward with an equally modern direct tax system, with competitive rates, fewer exemptions, taxes that incentivize savings and investment. That's a challenge for the future as well.
Yeah, please.
So Hina Gambhir from NDTV Profit. 2 questions. One, on one hand, we understand that the macroeconomic situation it's looking much better, at least from the inflation point of view. But if you look at the industrial output data, that still shows that, the demand remains to be weak. And we have been talking to bankers and credit offtake has not really picked up. So how are we projecting an 8.1 to 8.5% growth? Where will that come from? And second, in the economic survey, you've written that liberalization in FDI and retail could create possibilities for filling in the massive investment and infrastructure deficit and supply chain inefficiencies. So are you putting in a case for FDI in retail, something which the current government really is opposed to?
I think that was said in the context of the agricultural markets, and the author of that paper is Mr. Kolamkar. So, Mr. Kolamkar, I'll put you on the spot. If not, please go ahead.
No, what I had said in that chapter was we have been taking various short-term measures to control inflation. But for stable inflation in a sustainable manner, we'll have to have huge investment in agricultural sector. And one way to do that is to increase public investment. But there are limits how much a public investment can go up. So another way is that we already have a policy on multi-brand retail, where state government have to take a call. Now, only thing is there are a large number of conditions regarding sourcing, how much capital has to come in, and so on. And it is left to the state government to accept it or not. The present government doesn't believe in this particular policy, but probably over a long, since we are talking about sustainability of inflation being low, probably we could take recourse to FDI in multi-brand for the purpose of some investment in the supply chain infrastructure. That is the suggestion which has been made.
So just to amplify that thought, I think, part of the reason for distortions in agricultural marketing is that the farmer doesn't have enough choice in terms of, who all he can sell to, right? So that's one problem, but that's compounded by the fact that even where some of these restrictions have been removed, there just isn't the infrastructure to facilitate development of markets. And there are many ways of, creating those markets. There can be public investment, there can be private investment. And I think when you look at the whole package of what's possibly be done, these are all options that, should be considered going forward.
So last two questions, yeah, please.
Sir, many thanks for volume 1 of the eco-survey. As a student of economics and a reporter of economy, it's very educative, much more than any of the previous eco-surveys that I have read. Especially the analysis on the connection between the poverty gap and the spending on subsidies. My question, however, is about the chart that in your presentation on the total transfers from the 14th Finance Commission. You said that the average of the last 3 years was 64%, and the BE for the year starting April 1 on the basis of the 14th Finance Commission would be 65%. So is there really such a big jump in the total transfers from the center to states? That's my first question. And my second question is that in one of your analyses, you say that the employment growth went up from 11% to 12.2% between 2009-10 and 2011-12. So is it correct to say that India faced jobless growth under the previous government?
That second question, I'm going to ask Anandi to answer that. But on your first point, let me just clarify one thing, that the chart that we presented had, the first bar, if you can go to that chart, actually it's worth elaborating, just to be clear what we did. So this is what you're referring to, that one on the right. So notice what we've done is we're comparing 2014-15 under the 13th Finance Commission and the counterfactual of what 2014 would have been had the 14th Finance Commission applied to, because remember, we don't have data for 2015-16. So, but it's it'll give you a rough sense. And there what we're saying is that And that's a B, even for the 2014-15, it's the BE number, not the revised estimates, because again, that will be released tomorrow. And what we're saying there is that in 2014-15, under the old dispensation, the total share of taxes, national taxes, that went to the states. So that means that for the states is the own tax revenues, plus the tax revenues that come from the Finance Commission. If you combine those two, that's about 55 in 14-15, 55%. So 55% of all national tax revenues goes to the states. Had the 14th Finance Commission applied to that same year, we would have got something like 60, almost 62%. So it's like a 7 percentage point shift in how much more tax revenues are going to go to the states. Yeah? So let me start again. Because you're saying it's an economics lesson, so I'm failing very badly as a teacher here. So we know what happened in 2014-15, right? We had the 13th Finance Commission, we had a set of transfers, and the states got in all 54% of all taxes. Remember, the three sources, think of taxes as three categories. Central taxes kept by the center, central taxes that go to the states, and states taxes. The latter two go to the states. So you add the latter two and divide by the total, that's that figure. And because of the 14th Finance Commission, that's going to increase dramatically. Because much more of the center's taxes is going to go to the states. Oh, okay, I see, okay, yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, yes, but you see, that's again a very good question. But remember, that doesn't go up very much because on the one hand, whereas tax devolution went up, there's going to be a reduction in central plan transfers to the states. That's why it's a total figure. But the way to interpret it, it's very important, is that more taxes are going to the states, less spending is being done by the center and more by the states. So in fact, the smaller that number, the more the fiscal federalism that's being achieved. Because you get more taxes, and you get to spend more of your thing. So if the center were to spend even less, that number would be the difference would be even less. But it would actually be more fiscal federalism.
No,
yes, it's composition issue. Exactly. Yeah.
Sir, Ujjwal from Newsrise. Ujjwal from Newsrise, this side, sir.
Sorry?
Ujjwal Narayan from Newsrise. You have said that you underline certain policies for the double-digit growth. My question is, looking at the present trend of economy and the policy on which the present government is moving, by when you see, what is your outlook that India will achieve a double-digit growth trajectory?
I think I can make one relatively confident remark that if these policies continue, certainly on the basis of the new numbers, we can achieve double-digit growth. So that's my, what it will be on the basis of the old series, I don't know, because I don't know what the old numbers are going to be. Sorry, house. If you look at growth surges across countries, I think sometimes small triggers can be enough to get you a lot of growth for some period of time. But to sustain it takes a lot more reforms and sustained reform actions. Yeah. Yeah. So I think I've exhausted even your ability to ask questions. So let me just say that copies of the economic surveys will be available for distribution via the Press Information Bureau, some in the evening, and certainly over the course of the next few days. So for those of you, I would still urge you to go to the website and download it, but if you can't, there will be hard copies available. And thank you very much to all of you for coming. And thank you to my colleagues as well.
Thank you, sir. And friends, please join us for tea on 4th floor.